This podcast is for informational and educational purposes only and does not constitute legal advice. The views expressed are those of Tom Vincent and do not necessarily represent the views of Pearson Ferdinand LLP or any other affiliated entity. No attorney-client relationship is created by viewing or listening to this podcast. Information may not be complete, up-to-date, or applicable to your specific situation, and you should consult with a qualified attorney for advice relevant to your circumstances. This podcast and any associated materials may be considered attorney advertising under the rules of certain jurisdictions. Prior results do not guarantee a similar outcome.
Welcome, everyone. Welcome to our new podcast. We kind of teased this podcast the last time, but it's our new CISO versus legal versus cooperation podcast. We're still trying to fully flesh out the name and how we're going to promote this, but it's Tom Vincent and myself, and we're going to be talking about more of the legal side and the cooperation we have with CISOs.
Yeah, I'd hesitate to call it legal versus CISO, because we don't have one of those fancy belts like you give out
Darn it, I should have brought mine.
in your contest. But really, I mean, one of the reasons that we're doing this is because often it does feel like legal versus CISO, because each of us have our own jargon that we like to use. Each of us have our own objectives, and often if those objectives aren't translated or discussed, it can feel like there's a conflict between your legal department, if you are that big, or your lawyer, and your security department, if you are that big, or your individual responsible for security, because often it seems like they're trying to do different things, but often it's the same thing, just a little in different ways.
Right. And that's actually why we wanted to do this particular podcast, is because we want to show people that this cooperation between the IT security and the legal side is extremely powerful, and you can get so much stuff done. I relied on Tom, and I still rely on legal counsel with my clients to help me get my things done. And I do that by helping them get their stuff done. So that's the whole reason of this podcast.
Yeah.
This is what I had some great feedback on the last one. People really liked it. So I'm really excited about today.
I think this is great. I mean, we've had these sort of informal discussions for over 10 years now.
Oh, yeah. Yeah.
And so it's nice to sort of put them together in selfishly and immodestly a format that I think you all would enjoy listening to and hopefully get something out of. And to echo Jonathan's point, I would rely on Jonathan with when I would be negotiating or revising agreements, because in my in the legal context, when you talk about something like a material breach, I have a general idea of what that means. But if you're talking about a contract for software as a service or anything involving technical details, Jonathan could tell me, well, here's what that would really look like. So we could, just as a specific example, either call it out in the provisions or build in some measures to address what the impact of those particular manifestations of a breach would be.
Right. Well, and that's where that expertise comes in, because I want to bring the expertise on that cyber side to the table, literally to this table, and you bring in the expertise from the legal side. And ultimately our goal is to protect the organization, protect the people whose data we have, which is what we're going to be talking about today, at least partially, is knowing what kind of data we have and how we handle that. But I would say the first thing, and this is really what I wanted to get across even in the very beginning of this, is how do we get CISOs talking to legal and vice versa?
Yeah.
Well, the first step is this podcast. I know I've heard podcasts out there that you've had CISOs and legal on, but I don't know if I've ever heard of one that was specifically about this communication, this process of CISOs and legal getting together and solving problems.
Well, certainly, I think in our case, because we've done that, IRL so many times.
Yeah.
Trying to throw in some jargon of a different sort there. That it is I think our discussions, even though, if anybody's watched us talk, they will agree with me when I say they're not entirely legal or technical.
Yep.
But I think this is an example where the whole is greater than the sum of its parts when we
Yep.
look at the things that we've been able to do, and especially the the communication and reinforcement of the messaging that comes from legal and from information security on a regular basis when you have someone else telling the story,
Right.
and in such a way that somebody, they may not respond to what I say, but if they understand the technical piece of it and you can communicate it that way,
Yep.
then it's going to land with them. And in both cases, often, Jonathan and I would find ourselves talking to someone who is neither technical nor in the legal department. And so being able to combine the messages and sort of into a third type of audience
Yep.
is really invaluable.
Oh, sure, absolutely. And, the thing about you and I getting together or our two positions getting together, we can approach it at the different risks to the organization.
Mhm.
And when you're talking to the board and you're talking to the senior leadership, you really have to do that. You have to show them what the risks are from that technical side and from that legal side. And it's not just the risks though, but you have to show them the solutions.
Mhm.
And that's where our expertise comes in. I'm not saying I'm an expert on everything, but I try to be. I try to be that subject matter expert to the organization around cybersecurity. I know you do the same thing from the legal perspective,
Yeah.
and
And to that point, and this is something else that we're hoping to do with this, is there are a lot of podcasts I know I've seen or commenters out there that really, that when they talk about cybersecurity and they talk about the bad things that can happen, they do it really with a primary focus of scaring the audience into just doing something. And what often happens is the first thing that they do is not what works. And so they think, well, I can't do anything. So I'm just not even going to try.
yeah,
And I realize that even, that sounds doom and gloom, but I know I've seen it with some clients that I've worked with when they come to me and they've said, look, I don't know that there's anything that we can do. Well, let's start here because, as we go through, and one of the episodes we'll be doing in the future is walking through a breach and actions that Jonathan and I have taken both individually and in concert in dealing with breaches. But when we, when a breach happens, often there is this feeling on the client's part of a loss of control because it's no different. It's like somebody breaking into your house. But that's what we are hoping to do with this, is to say, okay, let's say that happens. Here are some things you can do to get that feeling of control back. Things that there are still consequences. There are still things you're going to have to clean up. But at least now you could say, okay, here's what we can do to get oriented the right way and to get ourselves in the right mindset to do what we need to do.
yep,
Because often that is the first step in anything in this, is just understanding what it is that you can do, what it is that you can't really control, and then focusing on, well, here's what I can do, and here's what I can do to address the things that I can't control.
right.
You know?
What's interesting to me is even though I go into a lot of organizations, and one of the very first things they always tell me is we're unique.
Mhm.
We have this unique scenario. We have this. We have that. And then an incident happens, and it happens just like every other incident at every other organization, whether it be a phishing email, ransomware, a denial of service attack, whatever it may be. And what I try to bring to them is I know what has worked in other organizations. Let's do that here.
Mhm.
I know how you have to talk to the regulators. I know how you talk to the law enforcement. I know the timings. If you don't have a plan, then let's use my general plan and it's going to work mostly for you. But the hope is that you build that plan, you build those processes, you build that expertise, you
Mhm.
build that skill set so you can prepare for that. Hopefully it never happens. But if it does, at least you'll be prepared. And that's really why we're doing this podcast, is to help people get prepared for, hopefully things don't happen, but if they do, you'll know how to handle it. And so the this first episode, the past episode, we kind of did a general overview on things, but we want to get into some details.
Yeah, yeah. And this one, we're calling "Who Does What."
Yep.
We're getting started, part one. Who does what?
Right.
And again, building on what we did in the intro to this in Secure AF is looking at, okay, so whoever the person is in this dynamic for you, that is the legal person and the technical person, what is it that they do? And then from there, because oftentimes getting started in any sort of security or privacy consideration can be somewhat daunting.
Sure.
And it's not what is the leader with respect to um, uh, business considerations.
Right.
It's not, unless your business is security, then security is often not your first consideration.
Right.
And so, in
Which
addition,
breaks my heart as a CISO.
I know, mine too. Um, but for you, my heart breaks for you in that one. But the idea being that as once we go through, okay, who's going to be looking at what, let's talk about, as you mentioned earlier, Jonathan, let's talk about what people, what those people then would have to do with the organization to start. And then in our next episode, we'll talk about bringing other people in who are necessary for this engagement, people like finance
Yep.
and executive management and others who are going to be impacted by what you do. And that's why it's best not only to do the right thing, but explain it the right way.
Right. Well, I'll have policies and procedures around it.
Mm-hmm. That's right.
So,
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
okay. Well, where do we start? I mean, this is
So here's probably approaching an organization that handles information. We talked a little bit last time about the kinds of information that an organization might have, but why don't you talk about, I think this might be helpful to you talk about what your role is as an internal CISO.
Yep.
And then I would say, okay, here's what I would do from an internal legal role, because it's very similar to what I would do externally.
Yep.
But and then what we would do with, let's just say for purposes of this exercise, we've got a company that's got a website and it sells things on its website and it takes credit card payments on the website. It uses some analytics tools, and it has a national customer base. Okay. So let's just start with that. What would you, as the CISO, let's say day one that you're hired, what would you do?
well, that's easy. And let's first talk about the title of CISO, because I think that really comes down to a couple of different variations over the years of what a CISO is, a Chief Information Security Officer. There are positions that is Chief Security Officer. That's a little different. There are things that are similar to a Chief Information Security Officer, an ISO, Information Security Officer, and then there's the chief version. But I would say in the world today, in the industry, when we're talking about a pure Chief Information Security Officer, that is someone who protects information. And by doing that, they're protecting the people's whose information you're dealing with, either protecting people because you have their data, so let's say PHI or protected health information, or FERPA data for students, or GLBA data for financial institutions, whatever it is. You have people's data and you need to protect it.
Mm-hmm.
So my job as a CISO is to understand where that data is, what the data is. First of all, that's the most important. What the data is, where is it at, and then what controls do I have around that data? Now, those controls are twofold. It's the controls that I'm going to put in to protect that data, and then there's controls that you need to have because of compliance requirements. So I can protect the data, I can lock it down, but then a compliance requirement may say that you need to monitor and log and review all of the access to that data. That's not necessarily a security issue. That's an access control issue. But as a CISO, my job is to make sure that's happening and make sure I'm meeting those requirements. So I look at this as a CISO within an organization. is the person who knows what data you have, where that data is, and the controls that are around the data, plus the requirements that are given to me by the organization, by a compliance, by policies and procedures to manage that data.
Mhm. No, I think that's right, and one thing I wanna mention before I'll give my own, uh, uh, similar summary is when we talk about protecting people's data, um, many times, especially I mean, I've been doing this for over 10 years now. I know, just as a lawyer, let alone what I did in my prior regulatory career. But I know often when people talk about a breach and they're concerned about information that gets out, their first question is, well, or sometimes their first sort of statement to explain why they either don't have any measures in place or why they're not concerned about any sort of breaches. Well, we don't have any individual customers. We don't have any personally identifiable information from individuals. We don't have any retail customers. Well, yes, but you do have employees,
Yes.
presumably.
Yes.
And often it's that employee information that one is an easier target for outside actors because
Sure.
it's not always protected as customer information is. But two, it can often be a harder target from the standpoint of, or I shouldn't say target, it can often be a more difficult exercise to address, in part because, as we'll get into in my legal role, if there is a breach and individuals have to be notified, it's the law of the state of residence of those individuals or the country of residence of those individuals in some cases that governs what that notification is and when it has to be sent. And often, especially if you are a company that has a benefits plan or anything like that, and you've got beneficiary information for beneficiaries that live in states where your company isn't, and that information gets out, then you've got to start looking at those state laws also. And what can start out being, a company with one location can end up being a 50 state plus exercise in legal review of what are your responsibilities in the event of a breach.
Well, and that's what we had. The last one that you and I worked together specifically in my last uh, job was 80 different countries, 50 different states, or 50 different states, 80 different countries were represented by the information that we had in our systems. And anytime, I'll tell you this, anytime we had any sort of incident, whether it was a breach or not, it starts as an incident. That was the first question he asked me. I was like, okay, where are they from? And I'd create the list for you, and we start working through that list of, okay, what requirements do we have?
Mhm.
But that's one of the things I don't think organizations understand is that data they do have, and the thing about it is they may not know they have the data
No,
because in some compliances, internet activity going to your website is
Mhm.
protected data.
That's right.
Information that they gather in the logs may be protected data. The information they have on employees, on their children, on their beneficiaries is protected data. So all those different things, I don't know of any organization out there that doesn't have data protection requirements. Now,
Mhm.
we talk about the data of people like PII, PHI, things like that, but you also the controls that I need to worry about also control confidential data. So it may not be people data, it might be patent data or intellectual property data or things. The controls are the same. I mean, I implement the same kind of controls around this.
Mhm.
But,
Mhm.
when we're talking about people, I don't know of any organization that won't have some data on people.
Yeah. And so from, when I'm hired, either let's say if I'm hired internally as a lawyer that's focusing on this, or a client hires me to look at it, that's generally the first question I ask is, what information do you have? Not not and this is where I think it's easy to precondition the client, not what sorts of personal information do you have, but what sorts of information do you have? Because for example, as you mentioned, some statutes include things like biometric information.
Yep.
They include things like IP addresses.
Yeah.
They include things like there's one state, for example, that actually includes mother's maiden name as a piece of information that can trigger a breach notification.
Yeah.
So, not the important thing is to not have the client go through that exercise
Yeah.
of determining what is covered. It's just, I want to know everything that you're getting.
Right.
And then the next thing that I typically ask is I want to see their, or not necessarily the next thing, but one of the things I often ask for is, what is your acceptable use policy like? And that's one of the things that as part of this, we'll have available is a sample acceptable use policy, or BYOD policy. So you can have that as a frame of reference. And if it's not something you currently have, we'd certainly encourage you to look at it, because it does, selfishly, it makes our jobs easier, but also I think it will help help you conceptualize, one, what we're talking about, but two, some risks that there may be to your organization that you haven't necessarily thought of. One of those being, for example, if you have an acceptable use policy, or if you don't have an acceptable use policy, I should say, chances are you have individuals, especially depending on how long they've been with your organization. It could be that their email account with your organization is the only email account that they have, or it's been their primary account. So they'll have years of everything from financial records if they bought a house or gotten a loan, medical records if they've had reports coming in from their doctor, information about their kids, and all of this other stuff that if there is an incident in your network, that could get out as well. And the acceptable use policy can help protect you if that gets out, in that you have told individuals, look, your
Yeah.
your information like that shouldn't be in our system.
Right.
It,
So, so let me ask you this, because if you've got a organization that, let's say they don't have an AUP and people are using it, I'll give you a perfect example. We had an individual who was storing tax information about clients not associated with their job. This was a side business, but it was stored on a local data share. So I found social security numbers of clients to this person that had nothing to do with the organization. How much risk is that to the organization? It's on I'm going to say my server, but it's on the server that I manage the controls on. That is not part of that person's job. We're not inviting these customers in, but that data is there. What kinds of risk? This is a real life scenario, because
Sure.
it happened to me.
Well, there's and let's parallel that with another one, more from a legal standpoint, which is one of my prior organizations. We had an individual whose wife had kicked him out of the house, and so he was having all of his correspondence with his divorce lawyer via his work computer.
Oh my!
And so from a legal standpoint, we had to explain to him that his communication, because in our AUP email policy, we said anything that goes through our network is ours and we have access to it and we can review it.
Sure.
We were able to show there's no expectation of privacy with respect to these communications. And therefore, if we were to get subpoenaed by his wife's divorce lawyer, we would have to turn over this information, or somehow basically devote time and resources to the inevitable legal battle between his lawyer and his wife's lawyer.
But that would be a legal request.
Sure.
And it would have to come from a process. It's not automatic that you're going to hand that over to them.
No, we would have to get a subpoena.
Yep.
But then you get into the issue of, depending upon your particular process, does your policy say that you will turn that information over?
Right.
Or do you have to notify that individual? And again, I'm not saying there are many different ways that could go, but all of this to say that now you're really getting the lawyers involved.
Right. Well, and that's the thing is, if I'm a CISO and I find this data, however I find it, it's now my responsibility to understand what risk that is, and I don't know that particular risk. And that's where I would come to you
Sure.
and say, "Hey, this is what I have found. I found it, based off of, a process that I do. Maybe I'm looking through the logs, maybe I'm doing Social Security number search or whatever it may be, but I found this data." Now, there's some data out there that in the cyber world that if you find it, you immediately turn that over to law enforcement. We're
Mhm.
not talking about that. We're
Sure.
talking about Social Security numbers. We're talking about PII. We're talking about information that's not part of your business, but it may be on your systems.
Sure. Well, and here's one, just sort of a walk that through. And again, this is purely going on particular state statutes. So let's say that we're under the law of a state where um, where improper access to this information is considered a breach.
Yep.
So there are states where there has to be some risk of harm to report it. In this instance, I think I'm not going to say you could argue because you're the CISO here,
Right. Right.
but I think the other individual could argue that, you know what, there wasn't any risk of misuse. It was in this particular directory. But again, I can say this, and I'm trying to keep from laughing because the fact is you've got somebody who put information in an environment where it was at risk, and again,
Absolutely.
now you're getting into a situation where you would have to argue, is there some risk of harm or whatever? But anyway, that let's go back to the original statute I was talking about, where sometimes simply access to that information is enough. It doesn't matter if
Yeah.
there's any risk of harm. If you've got somebody that accessed it without authorization, and that's authorization um, by the uh, by the party that collected it. So let's say this individual had it,
Yes.
and and he shared it was shared, or it was accessed by you or by the company, and he didn't authorize that. And again, you get into the issue of, well, who had access to this folder and everything else. Um, then you've got, but the other issue being, and this is what we're going to get to, what I'm going to talk about when I finally get to talk about what I do, um,
But
is
it's important stuff.
oh, it is. But where I was going with that was that this is where it's not just, that is the what we would call the wartime, or the
Yeah.
the reactive piece of this. A lot of it is, what has that individual told these clients of his
Yep.
that he is doing with the information, and who is it that has access to it?
Right.
You know?
Well, and I think that that's the important part, because if I find the data on my systems, those are not my clients, those are not anything, there may not be anything that I necessarily am worried about in terms of my requirements. That risk analysis needs to be done by him,
Mhm.
by that person who put it
Exactly.
on there. But that's where I'm going to come to you and say, okay, I have this on my data, or on my share, on my
Mhm.
server or whatever. What do I need to do? And that's where that relationship is really important. So now we get to
Yeah.
the point of, what do you do?
Yeah.
And how is, in a situation like that, how is that
Mhm.
going to play out?
Sure, and one thing I would say just for that immediate situation is, um, what I would suggest doing is log when you found that information.
Yep.
Basically secure it so it's clear that it's not going anywhere and really nobody else has access to it.
Right.
And then go to the individual who put it there and say, "This is locked down. We are keeping it locked down until you are ready until you are removing it from our system,
Right.
so that you can establish, once the other organization had access to it,
Right.
it was secured and there was no danger to it and nothing happened to it the whole time that you then understood that you had access to
Yep.
it, or that you had accessed it. So from the legal side, I mean, especially with respect to what I do with clients and what you and I have worked on, it's not much different. It's essentially, like I said, from a legal standpoint, it is figuring out, okay, first, what what are the laws, regulations, rules, etc., that apply to the information that you have. And then it is, what are the company policies that are in place? As you said, are they equal to or better than those compliance requirements? Because in some instances, it may be that the company has a stricter posture on certain things with respect to information than the compliance requirements do. And I will tell you, just as an aside, this is why it is so important that um, the uh, that the legal and CISO, particularly when it comes to security training, uh, are synced up. And this is also where you want to get your HR group involved. And we'll talk about that in our next episode.
Yep.
Because ultimately what we're talking about here is, if someone violates a fill in the blank, let's say that there is a statute that requires something, there's a regulation that requires something. For those of you not familiar with regulations, and they are passed by typically promulgated and finalized by executive agencies.
Right.
Then you have a company policy that is passed by typically the company's board of directors or other governing body.
We hope.
You have a procedure that is more detailed than the policy, and it may not be authorized or ratified at that level.
Yep.
But depending on which of those things an employee may violate may mean the difference between a reprimand and termination,
Or
worse.
Yeah. And that's the thing that people don't understand, because when we're dealing with federal laws,
That's right.
and people break them.
That's right. And so
Yeah.
so once I have that baseline of it, okay, here's what you've got. Then it's figuring out, okay, what do you do with it? And it's a lot like understanding, and I know some commenters don't like this analogy, but I think I'm using it in a different way than they don't like it. It's like understanding how the plumbing in your house works. You know, my house is, I have to figure this out again. I always have to figure it out. My house is 108 years old, and sometimes it rains in the living room. But I know that it rains. But I know that it rains in the living room, so I can do something about it. I know what not to do to keep it from raining in the living room. And just like this, it's like, how does information come into your organization? Where does it go? Is there a place where there's a leak in your system and it's pooling somewhere, or it's where it's not supposed to be?
Yeah.
And then also, how does it leave your organization?
Yep.
And it's, it's all of those. It's those points of entrance, points of exit, and where it goes all the way around. That's important, not only from making sure that there are policies to address that, but that if there are things that shouldn't be happening, those can be addressed as well.
Right.
And then to the extent that where it leaves the organization, and that could be because you have a client relationship that terminates and information leaves that way. It could be that you've contracted with a third party and you are sharing customer information with that third party. That information is going out that way. It could also be that you've got someone who is sharing information inappropriately. And when I've done cybersecurity training for prior clients, I always tell them, and that includes talking about it in the elevator.
Yep.
And so when we are trying to get a handle of, okay, what do we have and where's it going? Then we can look at, okay, where is it supposed to be going? What are these statutes that and regs and laws and statutes, regs, rules, and all these other things that apply? What is supposed to happen? And often they match up pretty well. Sometimes they don't, and that's because in an organization, we talked about before, unless your business is security, it's not always the first thing that comes to mind when you're engaging in your business. And so, information security is one of those things that changes every time you execute a contract. A contract is like it's like when you eat something. You're taking it into your system, and it's changing the way that your system is working.
Yeah.
And whenever you're contracting with a third party and you are providing information to that third party, you are changing that security profile.
Yeah.
And often that's done outside of the security context or the legal context. It may be that you have a sales officer who um, to make a sale has offered to provide a greater level of security than you are comfortable providing, or sometimes even a lesser level of security.
Right.
When I've worked with clients implementing encrypted email before, sometimes they have clients who just absolutely don't want to deal with it, and they insist on everything being sent to them unencrypted.
Right.
But also, you may have a contract. You may have somebody in procurement or somebody in one of your technical areas that signs on a software as a service vendor, and they say, you know what, we'll cut a third off the price if you let us maintain information about your usage of the software.
Right.
And often, again, someone whose business is not information may not necessarily recognize the value of that. But
Or the risk.
or the risk. And in a case with a client, I pushed back on that verbiage because the particular service was one where they would go in and they would purchase computers and office equipment for different locations. And the concern was that I raised to the client, even if they're not going to be sharing that information, even if that is for their internal use, they may have a pretty good roadmap of your business expansion plans, certainly historically, and may be able to extrapolate that going forward. And who's to say if they are compromised at some point, then a third party that you don't know would have that information.
Right.
And that's the other X factor when we talk about this information sharing is everything I've talked about is generally voluntary sharing.
Sure.
It's when we get into the involuntary piece, either from a breach or even sometimes sharing it with a third party who, because you have not put controls in place for that third party to not share your information further, they then turn around and share it somewhere else.
Right.
To a subcontractor, whatever. And again, that's part of the legal approach to it is where are those connections made? What are you getting? What are you doing with it? What do you have to do with it? And part of that, what are you doing with it is where is it going outside of not just your company? Where is it going to third parties and what are they doing with it?
Yep.
And that also gets to, for example, if you are sharing information, let's say you have a board of directors and you're sharing information with that board of directors. And this is especially something that nonprofits do because they often have boards of directors regardless of the size of the nonprofit. And often, what do they send those directors? They send them financial statements. Sometimes they send them PII on potential directors, potential donors, things like that. And again, that's something where, from a legal perspective, we need to look and say, is that something that you're allowed to do? And what is the legal risk of that? But for me, understanding, especially from a how do we fix that, that's something where I absolutely would then go, okay, Jonathan, what do I do?
Yep.
What can we put in place?
So I want to, we've only got a few more minutes of the podcast, but I want to kind of summarize. It sounds like, and this is what I truly believe, and this is how I've always thought about it, but you'd mentioned this when you go into an organization, you say, what are you doing? Why? And is it allowed? Or is it legal?
Mm-hmm.
When I go into an organization, I say, what are you doing? How?
Mm-hmm.
And is it secure?
Mm-hmm.
And I think those two pieces, you have to ask both those questions.
Mm-hmm.
Are you allowed to do it? And are you doing it securely?
Right.
And I think that's where that balance comes in.
Yeah, absolutely.
And we're talking about like the third-party vendors. I was going through all the different incidents that I've had over the years of seeing a third-party vendor when they get our data and they'll put a clause in there that they get to keep it forever.
Mm-hmm.
Drives me nuts when I see that in a contract.
Mm-hmm.
And then I see an organization that they don't have a data destruction policy or a data deletion.
Mm-hmm.
So they don't have any way to actually get rid of it in a secure manner.
Right.
So those are the things that I think are really important. You have to see it on both sides.
Yeah. And especially when, the things that we've talked about may not necessarily mean anything to the end customer.
Yes.
Because, and this is a discussion I have with clients also, which is we will talk at a future episode about privacy and how that figures into things. But for many customers, for end users, whether let's say they're a bank customer, whether they're buying from this company that we talked about, that I'll want to walk through the application of certainly what I do and then what you do to that company, um, it's understanding that from the customer, their concern is my information kept private often,
Sure.
and privacy for them is what effective security and effective legal controls
Yep.
gets you.
Right.
So in this fictitious company that we were talking about, that has a national presence, sells things online, uses an analytics tool, and um, uh, takes credit cards on its website. So, the first things I look at are, okay, it's a national presence. So what is it? And so what does their website say? And, we'll get into the specifics of these particular pieces later on, but one of those is going to be, what does their privacy policy say, which has been looked at by the FTC as something that is necessary if you are using their information.
Right.
And if you are using any sort of website analytics tool, you are using their information.
Sure.
And often that website analytics tool provider requires you to have a privacy policy anyway.
Right.
So I look at it from the standpoint of, okay, where are they collecting that information and what are they getting? But what are they telling the individuals that they're getting?
Yep.
And then it's, okay, so are you telling everyone what they need? Are they operating in enough are they operating enough in a particular state to be covered by that state's privacy statute and breach notification?
Right.
Because there are some affirmative requirements of those beyond just letting people know if something's happened to their information. If they are, then lastly, with respect to credit cards, you have PCI DSS issues.
Yep.
Where are they collecting that information? What are they doing with it? And importantly, is it clear to the customer that if they are not processing that information themselves, that there is a third party that is collecting that information?
Right.
And that's just, because I know we don't have a whole lot of time, but that's just sort of first thoughts, first glance. Here's what I would be looking at.
Yep. What I'm going to be looking at, I'm going to look at the organization's website and what technology are they using. When they get the data that they're collecting, I'm going to see how are they collecting it? Is it a web form? Is it some other submission process for the customers to submit that? Where are they storing it at? So, the website or the process in which these customers interact with this organization, that data is coming in somehow. I'm going to say, okay, is it secure coming in? They're going to store it. Is it secure as they store it? I'm going to look at who has access to it. Is it everybody in that organization, or is it going to be just those few people that need to have access, that business need? And then I'm going to look at their destruction processes, because the data coming in, it's not just again, we're talking about web pages. That's what about the logs? What about firewall logs? What about the servers that are just collecting who's accessing it and the distribution of that through AWS or Azure or whatever it may be. So I'm going to see, okay, what are we collecting there that you don't know we're collecting? And how is that being stored? And how is that being accessed? And I'm going to do all those processes. And the last point is, how long are we keeping it? We've stored this data. We have it. We've collected it. We've stored it. We've used it. Now is the time to let it age off. How are we backing it up? Well, then I got to get rid of the backups, because once you get rid of data, you're supposed to get rid of data. So those are going to be all the things that I'm going to be looking for in that situation of, okay, if you're collecting the data legally, which is I'm going to rely on Tom to tell me that, or legal counsel or whoever's going to be working on that.
Right.
I'm going to go, okay, now that I know you're collecting it legally, how do we secure it? What is the data life cycle? How do you get it? How do you store it? How do you use it? How do you destroy it? So those are the things that I'm going to be looking for as a CISO.
And again, I think, as each of us have said, you start from the outside in. You start with what is it that you're getting from the outside, understanding that there's information that's collected and generated on the inside as well.
Yep.
Because we haven't gotten into, for example, again, topic for a future show, how the state of California treats inferences that are drawn,
Right.
where, that's a situation where even with publicly available information, you're essentially creating PII inside of an organization.
Yep.
And there are particular requirements for that. And that's when we get into, okay, what are the internal workings? Here's what here's it going into your system, but then what happens while it's there?
Yep.
And then that's where it's important, as we'll talk about next time. That's why it's important to bring in some of these other individuals, like your executive management, certainly business line managers, because anything that you recommend, because security is not an end unto itself, you got to make sure that it's consistent with what the business goals of the organization are,
Right.
and understanding that how your whatever it is that you recommend. And again, this is why this discussion is so important. Is what you may recommend to address a particular legal issue, uh, is what the effect of that is from a technical standpoint, and then from a business standpoint overall.
Right. So that said, that's our first official episode of this CISO and legal. I'll get rid of the versus legal, just and legal. Or we'll do legal and CISO. We'll switch it back and forth. But that's really kind of what I want to get into on this podcast. Is I want to talk about actual things that people are going to see and how they need to think about this. Here's a real life scenario.
Mhm.
What do we need to do different? And of course, we're going to have lots of stories on this. Both Tom and I have great stories. Well, I think they're great, but we have lots of stories. But the whole point is when you walk away from this podcast, I want you to be able to go out into your organization, look at something and go, huh, I never thought about that before. We need to do it a little differently, or I need to ask these questions. I need to get my general counsel to go listen to this podcast. Got these two guys with these stories talking about this stuff, and let's make things better.
Yeah.
So,
Absolutely.
all right. Well, thank you, Tom.
Thank you,
Thanks for
Jonathan.
coming out and getting on the podcast with us. For the audience, thanks for joining us. We've got another episode coming up soon. Please let us know if you guys have any questions. We're going to be out on the website in the comments looking at this stuff and hoping to get your feedback, because we want to make this podcast useful to you as the audience members, as these organizations in the industries, to make things better.
That's right. And just a quick blurb on what we've got coming up next. You've heard us talk about some things. We're also looking at doing some industry-specific situations. One involving financial institutions is one I'm thinking of right now, and also the energy industry, just because there are particular things that can come up there that are unique, and it's important to understand in those scenarios, not just the interaction between CISO and legal and executive management, but also your supervisory regulators. So we'll be talking about that as well. And also, as I mentioned before, we'll have a couple of documents that will be part of this that you can take a look at and hopefully glean something from as well. And with that, we will see you next time.
Yep. Thanks, everybody.
Thanks all.